The Whitmore estate sat at the edge of the city, like a kingdom that had forgotten how to be warm. 42 rooms. 14,000 square feet of polished marble, cathedral ceilings, and windows tall enough to frame the sky. At night, when the lights inside burned against the dark, the house glowed like a lantern, beautiful from the outside, hollow from within. Alara Santos had worked there for 8 months. She was 31 years old, small-framed, with the kind of quiet dignity that people often overlooked until they needed it most. She had taken the live-in position as a senior housekeeper because it came with a room of her own and, crucially, a room beside it, just large enough for a toddler's bed, a second-hand toy chest, and a mobile of paper stars she had folded herself on the night bus home from her previous job. Her son, Mateo, was 3 years old. He had his father's dark curls and her mother's stubborn chin, and he had recently developed the habit of narrating everything he saw in a whisper, as if the world were a secret he was being trusted to keep. "Big stairs, Mama," he had breathed on their first morning, holding her hand at the base of the grand staircase, craning his neck upward. "Like in the castle book." "Yes, baby, like in the castle book." She had told him the rules gently, but firmly, that first week. "Stay in our rooms when Mr. Whitmore is home. Don't touch things that aren't yours. Use your inside voice. Always your inside voice." Mateo, who was constitutionally incapable of understanding why he could not simply be friends with everyone he encountered, accepted these rules with the solemn nod of a diplomat, and then broke them one by one over the following weeks, not out of defiance, but out of pure, luminous curiosity. Dominic Whitmore was 36. He had the kind of face that appeared on magazine covers and annual reports, sharp jaw, dark eyes, an expression calibrated to project authority while revealing nothing. He had built his technology company from a rented garage into a global infrastructure firm worth $11 billion by the time he was 32, and in the 4 years since, he had reportedly not taken a single vacation. He was also, Alara observed in the careful way that people who work invisibly in large houses observe things, completely and utterly alone. Not in the way of a man who preferred solitude. In the way of a man who had been hollowed out by something and had not yet noticed the echo. He ate dinner standing at the kitchen island, reading briefings on his tablet. He slept, when he slept, on the couch in his study, still dressed, a half-empty glass of water on the floor beside him. His bedroom, she had noticed when she aired it on Thursdays, smelled faintly of a cologne that was no longer purchased, and there was a photograph on the nightstand, face down, that she never turned over. His mother had died 14 months ago. She had learned this not from him. They had exchanged perhaps 40 sentences total, but from the household calendar, where the date was still marked in red pen. Mom, hospital. And then, 2 weeks later, a single word. Arrangements. He carried grief the way some men carry injuries, without mentioning them, moving carefully around the damage, convincing themselves and everyone else that they were fine. Alara understood grief. She had her own. She simply carried hers differently. She poured it into Mateo's bedtime songs and his school lunch notes and the paper stars that spun slowly above his pillow. She had not planned for Mateo to ever encounter Mr. Whitmore directly. The house was large enough that their orbits rarely intersected. She managed this carefully, scheduling Mateo's outdoor playtime during the hours when Mr. Whitmore was in meetings, ensuring he was in their rooms by the time the front door opened each evening. She had not, however, accounted for rain. On a Tuesday afternoon in November, when the garden was sheeted in cold gray drizzle and Mateo had exhausted every indoor activity she could devise, she had turned her back for 7 minutes to respond to a catering coordination email. 7 minutes. When she looked up, he was gone. She found him on the 3rd floor. Mateo had not meant to go to the 3rd floor. He had meant to go to the kitchen to get a cup of water, which was allowed, and then he had seen the stairs, and the stairs had curved in a way that looked like it might be going somewhere interesting, and interesting things were, in Mateo's experience, worth following. The 3rd floor was different from the rest of the house. Quieter. The carpet was thicker, the light dimmer, and there was a smell, wood polish and something older, like the inside of a library. At the end of the hall, a door was slightly open. Through the gap, Matteo could see the edge of a very large desk and, past it, through tall windows, the rain sliding down the glass in long silver lines. He pushed the door open with one finger. The study was enormous. Shelves of books ran floor to ceiling on two walls. There were framed photographs, buildings, city skylines, people in suits shaking hands, and a large globe on a stand in the corner that Matteo immediately identified as the round thing from his atlas. On the desk, stacks of papers and 3 separate screens, all dark. And on the leather couch by the window, face turned toward the rain, one arm hanging off the edge, was a very large man, fast asleep. Matteo stood in the doorway for a long moment, processing this. He recognized Mr. Whitmore from the few times he had seen him from a distance, once going to his car in the morning, once passing the kitchen doorway.
He was big.
Grown-up big, the kind of big that usually meant authority and consequence. But asleep, with his mouth slightly open and his tie loosened, he looked different. He looked, Matteo thought, with the precise diagnostic capability of a 3-year-old, like he was sad even when he wasn't awake. Matteo had a theory about sad people. He had developed it after his grandmother died, when Mama had cried for 3 days and then stopped crying but still had the crying face sometimes, the one she thought she was hiding. He had discovered, through rigorous scientific experimentation, that sad people felt better if you gave them something. He patted his pockets. He was wearing his blue overalls with the kangaroo pocket, and he conducted an inventory. 1 dried pasta shell from art class, 3 small stones from the garden, a sticker of a dinosaur with 1 corner bent up, and a folded piece of paper. The paper was important. He had made it that morning at the little table in their room, with the blunt crayons and the sheet of construction paper Mama had left out for him. He had been making a flower, which was his current specialty, though his flowers tended to look more like explosions of color than any botanical specimen. He had used every color available, red and orange for the petals, purple for the stem, blue dots around the edges because blue dots made things better. Then he had folded it carefully in half, the way Mama showed him when she made cards for people. He crossed the room very quietly, the way Mama had taught him when she said inside voice, but for his feet. Soft steps. The sleeping man didn't move. Matteo stood beside the couch for a moment, studying the large face. Up close, he could see that Mr. Whitmore had lines on his forehead, the kind his Mama got when she was thinking very hard about something difficult. Even in sleep, they didn't quite go away. He unfolded his paper flower and smoothed it with his small palms. He reached up and placed it very gently on the edge of the couch cushion, right beside the man's hand. Then, because it wasn't enough to just leave a thing without explaining it, Mama always said that, he leaned in close and whispered, "I made this for you." He said it the way you say the most important things, very quietly, very carefully, as if the words themselves were something fragile. Then he turned and padded back toward the door. He had almost reached it when he heard, behind him, the deep, rough sound of someone who had not quite been asleep after all. "Hey!" Matteo turned around. Mr. Whitmore was sitting up. His tie was still crooked, his dark hair flattened on one side, his eyes, brown, Matteo noted, like Mama's good coffee, fixed on him with an expression Matteo couldn't quite name. Not angry. Not exactly. Something more complicated than angry. He looked at the paper flower in his hand. He looked at Matteo. "You made this," he said. It wasn't really a question. Matteo nodded. "All the colors," he confirmed. "Blue dots are extra." Something moved across the man's face then. Quick, like a cloud crossing the sun. His jaw worked silently for a moment. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice lower now. "Careful." "Matteo," said Matteo. "My mama works here. She's very good at cleaning." He felt this was important context. "I know," said the man. He looked at the flower again for a long moment. "Why did you make this for me?" Matteo considered the question with appropriate gravity. "Because you looked like you needed one," he said simply. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Dominic Whitmore, 36 years old, $11 billion net worth, had not cried in 14 months. He had been very disciplined about it. He came extremely close to failing that discipline right now, looking at a paper flower drawn in every crayon by a 3-year-old he had never spoken to, who had walked into his study on a rainy Tuesday afternoon and, without being asked, noticed something no one else in his life had seen fit to name. He cleared his throat. "Thank you, Matteo." Matteo smiled, a wide, uncomplicated, sunrise smile. "You're welcome," he said, and then, helpfully, "My mama makes good soup when you're sad. Maybe ask her." He turned and walked out the door. Dominic sat alone in his study, holding a wrinkled paper flower, and did not move for a very long time. Alara found Matteo on the second-floor landing, sitting on the top step and examining one of his small stones with serious concentration, as if it owed him an explanation. She exhaled the breath she had been holding since she discovered his absence, crouched down, and gently turned his face toward hers. "Where did you go?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. "Third floor," he said, without any particular sense that this was remarkable. Her stomach dropped. "Matteo." "I gave Mr. Whitmore my flower," he added. "The good one, with the blue dots." She closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. When she opened them, she took Matteo by the hand, brought him back to their rooms, settled him with his building blocks and a firm instruction to stay, and then stood outside her door for a moment with her hand flat against the wall, gathering herself. She would have to apologize. She would have to go up to the 3rd floor and find Mr. Whitmore and explain that her son had wandered where he shouldn't have and that it would absolutely not happen again, and she would have to do all of this without making it worse, without seeming unprofessional, without Mrs. Santos. She turned. Mr. Whitmore was standing at the end of the corridor. She hadn't heard him on the stairs. He was still holding the paper flower. "Mr. Whitmore." She straightened instinctively. "I'm so sorry. I turned my back for a few minutes, and it won't happen again. I'll make sure." "He said you make good soup," said Dominic Whitmore. She blinked. Pardon?" "When someone said, 'Your son said you make good soup.'" He paused. The corridor was very quiet. Outside the tall window at its end, the rain continued its patient conversation with the glass. "I was wondering if that was true." Alara stared at him for a moment. He looked, she realized, almost embarrassed, which was an expression she would not have thought his face capable of, given that she had only ever seen it arranged in confident, boardroom composure. His tie was still slightly crooked. There were shadows under his eyes that went deep, the kind that accumulated over months, not nights. "I can make soup," she said carefully. "I'm not asking you to work extra hours. I'll pay." "I'll make soup," she said again more simply. And then, because it seemed like the honest thing, "No charge." He looked at her for a moment with that complicated expression she was starting to recognize, the one that meant he didn't know what to do with an act of uncomplicated human kindness, which suggested he hadn't encountered enough of them. He nodded once and went back upstairs. Alara made lentil soup with cumin and lemon, the recipe her mother had made for every hard day of her childhood. She cut bread from the loaf she'd baked that morning, brought it up to the 3rd floor on a tray, knocked, and left it outside the study door when he called for her to leave it there. She went back to their rooms. Matteo was asleep by then, curled small in his bed, his breathing the slow, even rhythm of a child who has no reason to worry about tomorrow. She sat in the chair beside his bed and did not think about the paper flower or the way Mr. Whitmore had been holding it, careful, as if it were something that could break, or the shadows under his eyes. She was very disciplined about not thinking about it. She was only partially successful. Over the following days, things shifted in ways too subtle to name. Mr. Whitmore began coming down for dinner instead of eating at his desk. He didn't say much. They weren't at the stage of saying much, but he sat at the actual dining table and ate actual meals, and occasionally she would hear him on his phone afterward in a tone that sounded less like a man managing a corporation and more like a person having a conversation. Matteo, who had been promoted in his own mind to the status of Mr. Whitmore's friend on the strength of the flower exchange, developed an intense interest in the 3rd floor that Alara managed with vigilance and a great deal of distraction activity. She introduced an elaborate system of supervised exploration. They could walk through certain rooms together, on days when Mr. Whitmore was not home, and she used these excursions to point out interesting things. The globe, the architectural drawings framed on the walls, a model of a building in a glass case. He makes things, Matteo said one afternoon, studying the model with the same gravity he'd given the stone. He does, Alara agreed. Like I make things, said Matteo. In a different way, but yes. Matteo nodded slowly, as if filing this away. Then we are the same, he concluded, with complete satisfaction. Alara said nothing, because she didn't know how to explain that it was not quite as simple as that the man upstairs was not a 3-year-old's peer, that their lives existed in entirely different registers, that this arrangement was professional and therefore bounded. She didn't say these things because, looking at her son's certain face, she had a feeling he already knew something she didn't. 3-year-olds frequently did it. It was Dominic who brought it up first. He came into the kitchen on a Saturday morning, her Saturday, technically the half-day he paid her for, and found Matteo at the island with a glass of orange juice and a piece of toast, conducting what appeared to be a highly involved conversation with a small plastic elephant. Dominic stopped in the doorway. Matteo looked up. "Hello," he said. "Hello," said Dominic, with the slightly formal uncertainty of a man who did not have much practice with small children. "Sit down," said Matteo, patting the stool beside him with proprietary authority. "I'm showing Pedro about toast." "Pedro is the elephant," Alara explained from the stove, without turning around, her voice carefully neutral. Dominic sat. He accepted this the way he might accept an unusual agenda item in a board meeting, with wariness and a willingness to be surprised by the outcome. Over the following hour, while Alara made breakfast and tried very hard not to listen, Matteo gave Dominic a comprehensive education in the properties of toast, the personality of Pedro, the plot of the book Mama was reading to him about a bear who wanted to find someone to love, and the fact that the moon was just a nightlight for the whole world. That's all. It's not complicated. Dominic, she noticed, from the corner of her eye, from the sounds of the exchange, did not condescend. He did not use the high, vaguely strained voice some adults employed with small children, as if childhood were a foreign country with a difficult language. He asked questions seriously, as if the answers mattered, and listened to the answers as if they did. When Matteo slid off the stool and went to get Pedro from the next room, Dominic was quiet for a moment. "He's remarkable," he said. Quietly, not performatively. Alara turned. "He is." A pause. Outside, the November garden was frost-edged, the bare branches of the oak tree tracing lines against a white sky. "My mother would have loved him," said Dominic. She hadn't expected that. The quiet that followed was delicate, the kind you step around carefully. "Tell me about her," she said, and was surprised to hear herself say it. She was usually more careful with boundaries than this. But there was something about this man's solitude, the way it pressed against the walls of his own house, that made careful feel, just then, like unkindness. He was quiet for a long moment. "She was stubborn," he said at last. Completely, infuriatingly stubborn. She grew up with nothing and she decided that was not going to define her children, and it didn't. Not because she gave us things, but because she gave us this absolute certainty that the world could be changed if you pushed hard enough on the right places. He paused. "She was the only person in my life who ever told me to stop working and go outside." Alara smiled at her coffee cup. "She was sick for a long time," he said. "I thought I was prepared. I wasn't." He looked at the table. I haven't dealt with it very well, I think." "No," said Alara gently. "I don't think you have." He looked up. Most people, she had found, expected to be contradicted when they admitted to failing at something. He looked almost relieved. "There's a photograph," he said. "In my room. I turned it over because I couldn't." He stopped. Started again. "She's smiling in it. She was in the hospital already, but she's smiling because I told her a stupid joke, and I can't look at it because if I look at it, it becomes real in a way that He stopped again. Matteo came back into the kitchen with Pedro and a second elephant, which he introduced as Pedro's cousin Maria, recently arrived from a long journey. Dominic looked at the elephants. Something moved through his face, something old and aching, and underneath it, something that was trying, very slowly, to come toward the light. "Your photograph," said Alara that evening, after Matteo was in bed and she had been about to go to her room. She stopped him at the foot of the stairs. Turn it back over. He looked at her. The real things are the ones that hurt, she said. That doesn't mean you shouldn't look at them. That means they were real. She paused. Looking at the things that were real, that's how you keep them. He stood very still on the stair. I lost someone too, she said. Mateo's father. 2 years ago. Car accident. She said it the way you say the things you have learned to carry, not without weight, but without being crushed by it. Some mornings I can look at his picture, and it's the most beautiful thing in the world. Some mornings I can't look at it at all. She met his eyes, but I never turned it over. She went to her room. In the morning, when she went to air his bedroom, a Thursday, the photograph on the nightstand was face up. A woman with dark eyes and Dominic's jaw, laughing in a hospital chair, clearly mid-sentence, caught in the reckless joy of a stupid joke. Alara stood in the doorway for a moment and did not look at it for too long, because it belonged to him. But she was glad it was there. She was very glad it was there. It happened on a Wednesday, which later struck Alara as appropriately ordinary for an extraordinary thing. She was carrying a basket of clean laundry from the utility room to the main stairs when she heard her son's voice from the direction of the study. The door, unaccountably, slightly open, saying, with characteristic directness, Dom, you're doing it wrong. She set the basket down and stood very still. Wrong, said Mateo. The block goes on top, like a hat. It's structurally unsound, came the response. Dominic's voice, lower, with something in it that she had not heard there before. Something almost like warmth, though warmer than warmth, the way a coal glows before it becomes flame. Buildings need to be brave, Mateo explained patiently. A pause. That's not really how architecture works. Pedro thinks it's right. A brief silence, presumably of consultation with the elephant. Pedro says yes. Pedro, said Dominic, is not a structural engineer. Pedro has been on a long journey, Mateo said, with the tone of someone citing credentials. He knows things. Alara pressed her lips together and did not laugh. Or she laughed very quietly, with her hand over her mouth, alone in the corridor with a laundry basket. She did not go in. She picked up her basket and went upstairs and folded sheets with methodical care and tried very hard not to think about the fact that her 3-year-old had started calling Dominic Whitmore Dom, apparently by unilateral decision, and that Dominic Whitmore had apparently not corrected him. The thing was, she had been trying not to notice things for a while now. She was very practiced at it. She had not noticed the way he had started asking after Mateo in the mornings casually over coffee. How'd he sleep? And is that dinosaur phase still going? As if it were perfectly normal, which perhaps it was, except that it had not been normal 2 months ago when she had first arrived in this house. She had not noticed the evening Mateo had had a fever and Dominic had appeared in the corridor outside their rooms with children's ibuprofen and a look on his face that was entirely unreadable except that it was not the look of a man who is professionally concerned about his housekeeper's child. She had not noticed the way he listened when she spoke, with the particular quality of attention that meant he was not waiting for his turn to talk but was actually genuinely receiving what she said. She was not noticing these things because she had Mateo to think of. Because they were employer and employee and the house between them was beautiful but it was his and the work was hers, and these things existed for reasons. Because she had learned, 2 years ago, that loss arrives without asking permission, and she would not build anything on uncertain ground. But it was getting harder not to notice. That evening, Mateo climbed into her lap while she read to him and said, with no preamble, Mama, is Dom our friend? She thought about it honestly. He's a good man, she said. That's not what I asked, said Mateo, which was, she reflected, entirely accurate. What do you think, she said. Mateo considered this. I think he needed someone to talk to, and now he has us, and that's why he smiles more. He paused. His sad face is getting smaller. Did you notice? She had noticed. She had absolutely noticed. Yes, she said. That's because we helped, said Mateo, with quiet certainty. She held him a little tighter and kissed the top of his head. Later, after he was asleep, she sat by the window and looked out at the city lights and thought about uncertain ground. About how sometimes people come into your orbit not because you planned it, but because something in the universe that is larger and less logical than planning decided they should. About her grandmother's saying, El corazón no pide permiso, the heart does not ask permission. She thought about a man who had been eating dinner standing up for God knows how long, now sitting at his table, who had been sleeping in his clothes on the couch, now apparently sleeping in his actual bed. She could tell from the slight disarray of the covers on Thursdays, the small signs that were not signs of emptiness. Who had been holding a face-down photograph, now holding a face-up one. She thought, I am not responsible for this. And then, more honestly, I am a little bit responsible for this. And then, most honestly, I don't entirely mind. She went to bed. She dreamed about nothing in particular, which was, she thought, the most peaceful dream of all. It was December. Mateo had been asking about the Christmas lights for 3 weeks. Alara had planned a small celebration for the two of them. A tree in their room, paper stars, and the ones Mateo made, mince pies from the recipe her mother had given her. She had carefully, deliberately not thought about whether Dominic celebrated Christmas or spent it working through a stack of contracts in a room full of expensive silence. Then, on the 15th of December, he knocked on the door of their rooms. He was wearing the slightly self-conscious expression she had come to recognize as his version of vulnerability, the face he made when he was about to say something that cost him more than he let on. I was thinking, he said, about a tree. She looked at him. A real one, he said, in the main living room. I haven't had one in a few years. He paused. Mateo mentioned it might be nice. She pressed her lips together. Mateo mentioned it. Extensively, said Dominic, and there it was, something she had been carefully not cataloging, a half-smile, small and a little rusty, like a hinge that had been still for too long but was remembering its purpose. He gave me a full presentation, with Pedro as a visual aid. She breathed. It would be his first tree in a big room, she said. He'd like it very much. I thought if you both wanted to, we could do it together. He said the word together as if testing its weight, checking whether it would hold. Saturday. Pick it out. Put it up. She said yes. She told herself this was uncomplicated. It was a tree. It was a kindness extended to a child who had already extended more kindness to this man than most adults in his life had bothered with. Saturday arrived with clear cold air and the kind of winter light that makes everything look significant. They drove to the Christmas tree farm 40 minutes outside the city, Dominic's large car with Mateo in the car seat in the back, conducting Pedro through a narrated tour of the countryside as it passed. Alara sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window and was aware of a quiet in the car that was a different kind of quiet than the one she had encountered when she first arrived at the Whitmore house. That quiet had been hollow. This one was full. The way a room is full when it contains people who are comfortable enough with each other that they don't need words to fill the space. The tree farm was everything Mateo had dreamed of. He moved through the rows of firs with the reverence of a pilgrim, stopping to press his small palm against the needles, tipping his head back to gauge height with deadly seriousness. He rejected 3 trees on grounds that she could not entirely follow, something about the shape of the top which Pedro had opinions about, and then at the end of a long row, stopped in front of a tree that was slightly too tall and slightly asymmetrical on the left side and had a bare patch near the middle. This one, said Mateo. Dominic crouched down beside him. They were eye level. This one, he repeated. Why? Mateo pointed to the bare patch. It's got a hurt spot, he said. If we leave it, no one will pick it. Dominic was quiet for a moment. His profile, against the winter gray, was very still. You're right, he said. We'll take this one. They drove home with the tree strapped to the roof and Mateo asleep against Alara's arm before they'd gone 20 minutes, his hand still loosely holding Pedro. The heater hummed, the road unspoiled before them. He's extraordinary, Dominic said quietly, so as not to wake him. He has good instincts, Alara said. He has your eyes. He said it simply as a fact, not a compliment, the way you name a thing that simply is. Then immediately, I'm sorry. That was. It's fine, she said. He does. Another silence, but a different kind again. Alara. He said her name with a particular quality, as if he had been deciding whether to say it for some time. I am aware that he stopped. Tried again. I know that the way things have changed here over these months. I know that's not. I didn't plan. Neither did I, she said quietly. He was silent. We don't have to plan it, she said. We don't have to name it or figure it out tonight. But I want you to know. She paused, choosing carefully. You are not what I thought you were when I arrived. You are considerably more than I thought you were. The lights of the city appeared on the horizon. Neither are you, he said. They put the tree up that afternoon, all three of them. Matteo hung ornaments with magnificent indiscrimination, clustering them all at arm height, leaving the top bare. Dominic lifted him on his shoulders so he could reach the higher branches, and Matteo shrieked with delight and nearly dropped Pedro and the ornament simultaneously, and Alara laughed, genuinely, fully, the kind of laugh that lives in your chest, and the sound of it filled the room, filled the great hollow beautiful house, and did not echo because it was too alive to echo. At the top they put a star, paper, folded by Matteo that morning, slightly lopsided, entirely perfect. It's like the ones above my bed, Matteo said, from Dominic's shoulders. Yes, said Dominic. He was looking at the star. He was also, Alara noticed, looking at her. In the week between Christmas and the New Year, Dominic Whitmore sat across from his attorney and restructured three things: his professional calendar, his standing charitable contributions, and a clause in the household employment agreement that, with Alara's input, which he requested formally and took seriously, converted her position from live-in housekeeper to household manager, with significantly revised terms, appropriate compensation, and an explicit acknowledgement that she was a professional whose expertise went considerably beyond cleaning schedules. He had not, he was honest with his attorney and with himself, done this as a romantic gesture. He had done it because it was right, because she was deeply competent and had been undervalued, and because Matteo deserved a mother whose dignity was intact in her own workplace, and because Dominic had spent 14 months inside his own grief and his own silence and had mistaken both for strength, and was slowly, carefully, with the help of a woman he had not anticipated and a 3-year-old who had walked into his study on a rainy Tuesday, learning the difference. Alara accepted the new terms with the same direct, uncomplicated grace with which she had offered him soup. She read everything carefully. She asked 2 pointed questions.
She signed.
She also, 2 days later, left a card on his desk. Not a Hallmark card, she had made it the way Matteo made things by hand. On the front, in her own handwriting, a single line her grandmother used to say, La vida no es Maid por cuanto respiras, sino por los momentos que te quitan el aliento. Life is not measured by how many breaths you take, but by the moments that take your breath away. He read it twice. He put it beside the photograph. Matteo did not fully understand the changes that were happening around him, but he understood the texture of days, whether they felt heavy or light, whether the adults in his world had the tight faces or the open ones. The days were getting lighter. The faces were getting opener. He filed this information with satisfaction and went back to building towers with Pedro that were architecturally questionable and entirely brave. On New Year's Eve, they stayed in. Alara made a dinner that took 3 hours and filled the kitchen with the smell of garlic and herbs and something sweet underneath. Matteo was permitted to stay up until 9, at which point the excitement of anticipation was indistinguishable from exhaustion, and he fell asleep on the living room couch, still in his good shirt, Pedro tucked under his chin. Dominic carried him to his bed. Alara watched from the doorway as he laid the boy down with extraordinary care, as if he understood that sleeping children carry a particular kind of trust in them, the trust of someone who is entirely undefended and has decided, without deciding, that this is a safe place to be so. He came out. He pulled the door, almost closed. He stood in the corridor and looked at her. I want to tell you something, he said. All right. 8 months ago, if you told me that the thing that was going to matter most, that the thing that was going to pull me back to myself, would be a paper flower drawn in all the colors left on my couch by a 3-year-old who thought I needed one, he stopped. His voice was doing something complicated that he was managing with visible effort. I would not have believed you. I had decided that I didn't need, he stopped again. People who have decided they don't need anything, she said quietly, are the people who need everything. He looked at her. I know, he said. I know that now. The city outside was readying itself for midnight, and they could hear it distantly. Fireworks testing their launch somewhere to the north, a gathering brightness at the edge of the sound. The house was warm. The lopsided tree in the living room was lit, the paper star at the top slightly tilting, casting small shadows that moved. I don't know what this is, he said honestly. I know what I hope it is. But I don't want to. I know, she said. Neither do I. But I'm not willing to pretend it isn't something, he said. I spent a year not naming things that were real, and I know what that costs. She was quiet for a moment. It costs you the real things, she said. Yes. She looked at him, really looked the way she had learned to look at people who were saying something important in the words around the words they were actually saying. She saw a man who had been hollowed out and was, slowly, painstakingly, with the help of soup and paper flowers and toddler architecture, and a photograph turned back face up, refilling himself with things that actually mattered. She saw that he was afraid of getting this wrong. She saw that he was going to try anyway. She had learned, 2 years ago, that the people who are worth the risk are the ones who know the risk and choose to reach anyway. She reached out and, very simply, put her hand over his. He looked down at their hands. He turned his palm up. His fingers closed. They stood in the corridor of his large, no longer hollow house, and neither of them said anything, and the city beyond the windows counted down to something new. In his room, Mateo slept with Pedro tucked under his chin, safe in the knowledge that he had given away his best flower and received, in return, everything he had not known to ask for. He had been right, as 3-year-olds so often are about the most important things. The man with the sad face had needed a flower. The flower had needed giving. And the woman who made paper stars so her son would never sleep in dark had needed, without knowing it, to be in a house that was finally, gently, beginning to understand what warmth was for. Mateo's sad face theory was vindicated completely. And somewhere in the city, a firework climbed and burst into brightness over a house that was no longer quiet in the wrong way, a house that held, in its new and ordinary evenings, the sound of a child's voice explaining things to an elephant, the smell of something good on the stove, and 2 people being careful with each other in the way that means they already know it matters. In the morning, Mateo woke early and went to find them. They were in the kitchen. Dominic was making coffee, badly, as Mateo had observed before, and Alara was gently correcting him, and they were both laughing about something that had happened before Mateo arrived. He stood in the doorway and looked at them. He patted his kangaroo pocket out of habit, but it was empty. He had given away his flower. He didn't need another one. Some things once given keep giving.
Good morning, he said.
They both turned. The open faces. The light ones. Good morning, baby, said Mama. Good morning, Mateo, said Dom. Mateo climbed onto his stool at the island, adjusted Pedro, and accepted his orange juice with dignity. Outside, the new year had fully arrived. The garden was frost-white and clean, the oak trees bare arms holding the morning light. The photograph upstairs smiled on its nightstand. The paper star tilted gently at the top of a lopsided tree. And in the kitchen of a house that had once known only silence, 3 people sat together in the ordinary, irreplaceable miracle of a morning that felt, for all of them, like beginning.